The city of Maplewood, in rural Texas, was filled with a celebratory atmosphere on that sunny June day. The secondary school Riverbend High had hosted the graduation ceremony in its newly renovated gymnasium, decorated with silver balloons and celebratory banners reading, "Congratulations, Class of 2023. Entire families filled the space, chatting animatedly and taking photos. Among the graduates were Sophia Adams, a bright and determined young woman, who was recognized not only for her excellent grades, but also for her active participation in clubs and community projects. For Sophia, that day wasn't just about her, but about the woman who had inspired her her entire life. Her grandmother, Margaret Adams. Margaret, a 73-year-old woman, was a discreet figure among the elegant crowd that occupied the gymnasium. Dressed in a simple, faded blue dress that she had worn on several special occasions over the years, and worn-out shoes, Margaret didn't attract attention with her appearance, but rather with the warm smile that never left her face. She held in her hands a homemade fabric bag that she had sewn decades before, a symbol of her modest life, but full of stories. Despite her humility, Margaret was deeply proud of Sophia and was moved to be present at that moment. As the audience settled in, Margaret noticed that she was attracting stares. Some people whispered, looking sideways in his direction, while others tried to hide their laughter. She knew she didn't fit into the elegant standard of the event. The other graduates' mothers wore expensive clothes with sparkling jewelry, while their fathers wore impeccable suits. Margaret, however, was undeterred. She knew that her appearance was not luxurious, but for her, the important thing was to be by her granddaughter's side. "It's okay, Maggie," she murmured to herself in a reassuring tone. Among the nasty comments, two women sitting in the back row of Margaret were the most audible. "Who invited her? It looks like it came from another century," whispered one of them, adjusting her designer bag on her lap. The other laughed softly, agreeing. Margaret, although she had heard, pretended not to notice, remaining focused on the stage and the festivities. Deep down, she was used to this kind of judgment. Her entire life had been marked by struggles and sacrifices, and at that moment, all that mattered was seeing Sophia achieve what she had never had the opportunity to achieve: a complete education. Sophia, who was preparing behind the scenes with the other trainees, was completely oblivious to what was happening in the audience. She only thought about how special she wanted that moment to be for her grandmother. Since she was little, Sophia had heard Margaret's stories that shaped her as a person and taught her the value of effort, humility, and generosity. To Sophia, Margaret wasn't just her grandmother. She was their hero, and she planned to use the opportunity on stage to do something they would never forget. The event began with the school principal, Senior Robert Miller, giving a traditional speech, praising the graduates and their families. The school band played a solemn tune as each name was called to receive diplomas. The audience applauded excitedly at each announcement, but Sophia's name seemed to be expected with particular enthusiasm. Many knew of her exemplary career, but few knew in depth the woman behind her success. As the students took the stage, Margaret watched intently, her eyes shining with pride. She didn't see the judgmental looks around her, or perhaps she ignored them completely. For her, every applause and every smile was a collective celebration of Sophia's achievement. She held the fabric bag tightly, as if it were a talisman, something that connected her to everything they had experienced together. However, as the ceremony progressed, the nasty comments continued. "Did you see her shoes? They look like they're from the 60s, said a man in a low voice, eliciting muffled laughter. Margaret, who rarely showed any sign of discomfort, adjusted herself slightly in her chair. She knew that the simplicity of her appearance was a window into her humble life, but she didn't allow it to diminish the importance of that moment. When Sophia's name was finally called, Margaret stood up from her seat in a spontaneous gesture, applauding enthusiastically. "That's my girl," she muttered to herself as she watched her granddaughter walk up to the stage. Around her, the whispers stopped for a moment, but their gazes remained fixed on her, as if trying to decipher who this seemingly out-of-place lady was. Little did they know that everything was about to change. Sophia took the stage with a confident smile, but her heart was beating fast. She knew exactly what she was going to say and was determined to make that moment unforgettable. Not just for her, but especially for her grandmother. The microphone was adjusted, and she began with words that sounded familiar. First of all, I want to thank everyone who is here today. This is a special day for each of us graduates. But for me, it is special for another reason. The audience, which was already attentive, leaned in slightly, curious to hear what came next. Today, I want to talk about someone who is the reason I'm here, Sophia continued, her voice firm but charged with emotion. That person is my grandmother, Margaret Adams. The moment he mentioned Margaret's name, many of the eyes turned to the humble lady sitting in the audience. Some faces showed surprise, others, discomfort. Margaret, in turn, looked confused and emotional, placing her hand on her chest as if to confirm that it was Sophia who was talking about her. My grandmother, Sophia continued, is the strongest, most generous, wisest person I have ever known. She is someone who sacrificed everything to make sure I had opportunities that she never had. Sophia's voice began to crack, but she took a deep breath and continued on. She grew up on a small farm, working since she was a child to help her family. She dropped out of school early because she needed to support her younger siblings. And even so, he never stopped dreaming of something better for the next generations. At that moment, the gym was completely silent. Those who had whispered or laughed at Margaret now watched her with different expressions, as if they finally saw her beyond the simplicity of her clothes. Sophia continued, now looking directly at her grandmother. When my mother left us, my grandmother took on the role of mother to me. She taught me to be strong, to believe in myself, and to never forget where I came from. Every achievement I celebrate today is, in fact, her achievement. Margaret began to cry silently as she held an old handkerchief that she took from her purse. She never expected to hear such words, especially at an event like this. For her, the simple fact of being there was enough of a gift. But now, she felt seen and valued in ways she had never imagined. You didn't need that, Sophia, she murmured to herself, as she watched her granddaughter with eyes shining with pride. Sophia then did something unexpected. She took a folded paper out of her pocket and began to read it. It was a letter Margaret had written years ago, kept among her belongings. My dear Sophia, Sophia began, her voice trembling. I know life can be difficult, but I want you to always remember that you are strong, intelligent, and capable of achieving anything. I am here for you, today and always. Reading the letter brought tears to the eyes of many in the audience, who now saw Margaret in a new light. At the end, Sophia looked at the audience and concluded, my grandmother taught me that what really matters are not the clothes we wear or the money we have, but the impact we leave on people. She is living proof that true elegance comes from the heart. The applause started slowly but quickly turned into a standing ovation. People who had previously judged Margaret now gave her a standing ovation, some even with tears in their eyes. Margaret, embarrassed but deeply moved, just waved shyly. She didn't know how to react to that burst of recognition. Anna, a longtime friend who was sitting next to her, held her hand and said, you deserve every word, Maggie. For the first time, Margaret felt that her humility, far from being a source of shame, was something that inspired her. As Sophia walked off the stage with her diploma in hand, she ran to her grandmother and hugged her tightly. I love you, Grandma, she said. All of this is for you. Margaret returned the hug, still speechless, but with a smile that said it all. She, who had faced judgmental looks throughout the day, was now applauded and admired, not for her appearance, but for the immeasurable impact of her story. After the ceremony, the gymnasium Riverbend High, it has become a place for meetings and lively conversations. Sophia's revelation about her grandmother Margaret hung in the air like a truth that everyone was still digesting. People who had previously only whispered and laughed discreetly at Margaret's appearance now surrounded her with compliments and words of admiration. I never imagined you had such an inspiring story, said a woman dressed in a designer dress. Margaret, with her usual modesty, just smiled and said thank you, not really knowing how to react to the sudden interest that everyone showed. For Sophia, the moment of truth had turned out exactly as she expected. She knew the people in the gym needed to learn a lesson about humility and appearances, but most of all, she wanted her grandmother to know how much she was valued. "Grandma, you deserve all of this and more," she said, holding Margaret's hands as they walked toward the exit. The grandmother, still emotional, replied softly, "I just did what anyone would do for someone they love," but deep down, they both knew that wasn't the case. Margaret had sacrificed years of her life to ensure that Sophia could follow a different path, something few would have the courage to do. As the guests dispersed, some approached Margaret with curious questions. "How did you manage to raise Sophia alone, without help?" asked a man, holding a glass of juice. Margaret hesitated before answering, not liking being the center of attention. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "But when you love someone, you find strength where you thought there was none." His simple but meaningful answer left those present thoughtful. Many began to reflect on their own lives and the times they underestimated the sacrifices of others. Outside the gym, the golden light of the sunset illuminated the lawn where graduates and families took celebratory photos. Margaret tried to move away from the crowd, feeling a little overwhelmed, but Sophia insisted she take part in the photos. "I want you to be in all of them," said the granddaughter with a sincere smile. Reluctantly, Margaret accepted. When the photos were taken, something remarkable happened. Her presence, with her simplicity and serene expression, seemed to bring a different kind of beauty to the images. Later, as Margaret sat on a bench to rest, a group of parents approached. Among them was Rebecca Sanders, one of the women who had laughed at Margaret at the beginning of the ceremony. "I want to apologize," Rebecca began, visibly uncomfortable. "I judged the lady by her appearance, without knowing anything about her history. It was wrong, and I hope you can forgive me." Margaret, who never held a grudge, smiled gently and replied, "Don't worry, dear. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them." The humility in Margaret's response made Rebecca feel even more respect for her. As the evening approached, Sophia and Margaret stayed a little longer to talk to some friends and teachers. Sophia's math teacher, S.R.A. Wilkins, approached with tears in her eyes. "Sophia always spoke so fondly of you, but hearing all this today made me see how special she is because of you," said the teacher, holding Margaret's hand. "I hope one day I can be half the woman you are." Margaret, moved, thanked him, not knowing how to respond to so many words of affection. When they finally returned home, Margaret sat in the armchair that she had sewn herself years ago. The day had been long and full of emotions, but something inside her had changed. For the first time, he felt that his value, so often ignored, had been recognized. Sophia sat next to her, holding a cup of hot tea, and said, "Grandma, you don't need expensive clothes or jewelry to be extraordinary. You are already the most elegant and amazing person I know." Margaret laughed softly, touched by her granddaughter's words but still a little uncomfortable with the compliment. That night, Margaret reflected on everything that had happened. She knew that her life had always been humble and full of challenges, but also full of love. What Sophia had said on stage not only filled her with pride, but also made her realize that, in some way, her story had touched many people. For the first time, Margaret saw her simplicity not as something that set her aside, but as a strength that connected her to others. The day after graduation, Sophia decided to spend the morning with her grandmother. They sat in the small yard of Margaret's house, surrounded by flowers that the lady cultivated with care. It was a modest space, but full of natural beauty. Sophia, still moved by the ceremony, wanted to know more about her grandmother's life. "Grandma, you never told me many details about your childhood. Today, I want to hear everything," she said with a curious smile. Margaret, who rarely talked about herself, sighed before starting. "I grew up on a small farm in Plainfield. In Kansas," Margaret began, looking at the horizon as if revisiting the landscapes of her youth. "We were a big family with 8 brothers. Dad worked in the fields and Mom sewed clothes for the women in the city. We didn't have much, but we had each other." She paused, a faint smile forming on her lips. "I loved running around the fields with my brothers, even though I knew we would soon have to help with the chores." As Margaret continued, Sophia was impressed by her grandmother's resilience. She talked about the challenges of her childhood, such as the drought that devastated her city and forced the family to sell almost everything to survive. "I had to leave school at 12 to help my mother," said Margaret, with a tone that mixed sadness and acceptance. "I always loved learning, but at that moment, it was more important to put food on the table." For Sophia, it was difficult to imagine a life without the opportunities she had. Margaret then talked about how she met Sophia's grandfather, Edward Adams, who worked as a mechanic in a nearby city. "He was the kindest man I ever knew," said Margaret, her eyes shining with longing. "We got married young, and he always said he wanted to give me the world. But life had other plans. Edward died in an accident when Sophia was still a baby, leaving Margaret with the responsibility of raising her granddaughter alone. I remember the first time I held you in my arms," said Margaret, looking directly at Sophia. "I knew my life would change forever. It was difficult, but you gave me the strength to move forward. Every day by your side was a blessing." Sophia, who had always known about her grandmother's love, now understood the depth of that feeling. She held Margaret's hands and said, "You are the reason for everything I am, Grandma. I will never forget that." As they talked, Sophia began to realize that Margaret's story was more than a narrative of sacrifice. It was a lesson in courage and unconditional love. "Grandma, what would you like people to learn from your story?" she asked. Margaret thought for a moment before responding. "I want them to know that the value of a person is not in what they have, but in what they give. And that sometimes the greatest wealth is in the simplest things." The afternoon went on, and the two continued talking about memories, dreams and lessons learned throughout their lives. Sophia felt an even deeper connection with her grandmother, understanding that every choice Margaret made was driven by a love as pure as it was rare. As the sun began to set, Sophia made a decision. She would share Margaret's story with more people, so that others could be inspired too. For Margaret, that day was one of the most special of her life. She realized that although she had faced countless difficulties, every moment had been worth it. As they walked back into the house, Sophia said, "I want the world to know who you are, Grandma. I want everyone to see the strength and beauty I see in you every day." Margaret, smiling, replied, "If it makes you happy, my dear, then I am happy too." After the long conversation in the backyard, Sophia felt an uneasiness growing inside her. She knew that Margaret's story was much more than a personal inspiration. It was a testimony of resilience, love, and sacrifice that deserved to be known by more people. Determined to give visibility to her grandmother's legacy, Sophia began planning how she could share this narrative in a meaningful way. That night, she stayed up late, sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook and a cup of tea, jotting down ideas. Margaret, who had a habit of waking up early, found her granddaughter asleep on her notebook the next morning. "You didn't sleep well, my dear," said Margaret, pouring more tea for them both. Sophia rubbed her eyes and smiled. "I was thinking about something important, Grandma," he replied. "I want the world to know your story, not just so people know who you are, but so they learn something valuable about life." Margaret shook her head with a shy smile. "Oh, Sophia, my life is simple. I don't think people would be interested in something like that." But Sophia knew that her grandmother's humility was only part of her brilliance, and she was determined to show that to others. The next day, Sophia began recording short videos on her cell phone, recording casual conversations with Margaret about her childhood, her challenges, and her life lessons. She made sure to make everything as natural as possible, capturing the affectionate gestures and genuine smile that made Margaret such a special presence. During one of these recordings, Margaret, while watering the plants in the backyard, said something that remained engraved in Sophia's heart. "Life is not always easy, but it is always worth it, as long as you choose to love more than complain." Sophia stopped the recording for a moment, feeling the impact of the simple but profound words. When showing the first videos to some friends, Sophia received extremely positive feedback. "Your grandmother is amazing, Sophia," he said. "Jessica, your best friend. She has a wisdom that you don't find in books." Inspired by the reactions, Sophia started editing the videos and decided to publish them on her social networks. I want other people to know the Margaret Adams I know, Sophia wrote in the caption of the first video. Within hours, the post began to gain traction, accumulating likes, comments, and shares. Margaret, who had never used social media, was surprised to see the impact. Are people really interested in this? She asked in disbelief as Sophia showed her the comments. Many were from strangers, expressing gratitude for being touched by Margaret's words. She reminded me of my grandmother, read one comment. This made me think about what really matters in life, said another. Sophia explained to her grandmother that her impact went far beyond what she imagined. Grandma, you are helping people see the beauty in simple things, Sophia said. As the videos continued to spread, Margaret began receiving visits from neighbors who had never stopped to talk before. They came to share stories, ask for advice, or simply thank her for her words. Margaret, although a little shy, welcomed each person with the same warm smile and offered tea to everyone. I never thought people would want to hear what an old lady like me has to say, she confessed to Sophia. But her granddaughter knew that Margaret's power lay in her authenticity, something rare in a world so focused on appearances. A week later, Sophia received a message from a local media platform interested in writing an article about Margaret. Initially, Margaret resisted the idea. I'm not important, Sophia. I am nothing but a simple woman who lived an ordinary life, she said. But Sophia persisted, arguing that her story could inspire even more people. Grandma, what you consider ordinary is exactly what makes your story extraordinary, Sophia replied, with determination. Reluctantly, Margaret agreed to an interview. The interview took place in Margaret's living room, surrounded by the simple objects that told the story of her life. The journalist, Michael Tanner, was impressed by Margaret's serenity and the depth of her answers. If you could leave one message for the world, what would it be? He asked, at the end of the interview. Margaret thought for a moment before responding. Never underestimate the power of a kind heart. Sometimes that's what changes the world. These words, along with Margaret's full story, were published on the platform's website, and, once again, the public response was overwhelming. With the publication of the article, Margaret Adams became a kind of symbol of resilience and humility. People from other cities and even other states began sending messages to Sophia, thanking her for sharing her grandmother's story. My mother also sacrificed everything for me. Thank you for reminding me of her value, one message read. Another person wrote, Margaret is the kind of person the world needs to know. Please keep sharing more about her. Sophia, thrilled by the response, began planning ways to broaden the story's reach. Meanwhile, Margaret continued with her usual life, tending the yard, cooking her simple recipes, and visiting the local church. Despite her sudden notoriety, she remained the same humble and generous person. When a group of young city volunteers came to her asking for advice on how to better help the community, Margaret was surprised but offered her ideas. It doesn't have to be big or complicated, she said. Start with what you have and who is around you. Sometimes a simple gesture makes all the difference. The videos and article began to attract attention from larger organizations. A publisher contacted Sophia, proposing to turn Margaret's story into a book. The idea seemed too grand to Margaret, who laughed and said, I can barely write a letter, let alone a book. But Sophia saw an opportunity to immortalize her grandmother's wisdom. Grandma, we can write together, she suggested. I transcribe everything you tell me, and the book will be like a gift for generations to come. Margaret was hesitant, but agreed, as long as the process was simple and true to its essence. As the book project progressed, Sophia noticed something transformative about Margaret. She seemed more confident, more open to sharing her experiences and ideas. I never thought my life had so much value to others, Margaret said one night as they worked on the book. Sophia, smiling, replied, Grandma, your life has always been valuable. I'm just helping the world see that. The two spent many nights talking, remembering stories and laughing together, as they turned these memories into chapters. The repercussion was not limited to the book. Margaret was invited to participate in community events and school talks, where she shared her experiences and reflections. Although nervous at first, she found comfort in knowing that her words were touching hearts. During one of these lectures, She talked about the moment she dropped out of school to help her family. "I thought I was missing something big," she said, "but I learned that sometimes giving up something for love can be the greatest gain of all." The audience, made up mainly of young people, gave a standing ovation. Meanwhile, Margaret's impact was felt throughout Evergreen Hills. More people began to pay attention to their own families, valuing stories that were previously ignored. Young people started visiting their grandparents more frequently, and simple gestures of kindness became more common in the community. Margaret, without realizing it, had started a chain of change that went far beyond her expectations. "You have a gift, Grandma," said Sophia, after one of these events. "You inspire people to be better." Despite growing recognition, Margaret remained humble. She refused offers of money or sponsorship, insisting that everything she did was for the good of the people. "I already have everything I need," she said, and for Margaret that was true. She found happiness in the simplest things: the smell of freshly baked cake, the sound of Sophia's laughter, and the flowers blooming in her yard. As the book neared completion, Margaret and Sophia began planning a launch event. Sophia suggested doing something big, but Margaret asked for something small and communal. "I want it to be a time of gratitude, not ostentation," he explained. Sophia respected her grandmother's request and began organizing a modest but meaningful celebration that would bring together friends, neighbors, and everyone who had been touched by Margaret's story. That night, as Margaret was getting ready for bed, she looked up at the starry sky and smiled. His life, once marked only by silent sacrifices, was now a beacon of hope and inspiration. And for her, all of that was enough. The release date of the book, titled Roots of Love, The Story of Margaret Adams, arrived with great expectations. As Margaret had requested, the event was planned to be modest but meaningful. The small public library in Evergreen Hills was chosen as the location, decorated simply. Vases of flowers from Margaret's garden were scattered across the tables, and book covers were arranged carefully next to a frame with old photos of Margaret's life. Every detail reflected the essence of who she was. Margaret, upon seeing the prepared space, was thrilled. "It's beautiful, Sophia. Simple but full of love," she said. On the day of the event, the hall was full. Friends, neighbors, and even people from nearby cities came to honor Margaret. Many brought letters, flowers, and modest gifts as a token of gratitude. A group of young people carried a sign that said, "Thank you, Margaret, for teaching us the value of simple things." Margaret, still surprised by the attention she was receiving, walked around the room with a shy smile, greeting each person. "I don't know how to thank you for so much affection," she said repeatedly, as she held the hands of acquaintances and strangers. Sophia, who was watching the scene, felt proud and moved. That's exactly what she wanted: for her grandmother to see the impact her story and values had on people. During the opening of the event, Sophia took to the small improvised stage to give a speech. "Today is not just about a book launch," she began. "It's about celebrating a life that teaches us what really matters: love, sacrifice, and resilience. My grandmother is a living example that we don't need riches to be great." His words drew applause and left Margaret teary-eyed. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she hesitated. She had never considered herself good with words, especially in front of such a large audience. But seeing the attentive and friendly faces around him, he found courage. "I never imagined something like this could happen to me," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. "I always thought my life was ordinary with nothing special. But today, I realize that sometimes the simplest things are the ones that touch the most deeply." His speech was met with a wave of applause and emotional murmurs. After the speech, Margaret began signing copies of the book. Although she found it strange that someone would want her signature, she made sure to write a personal dedication on each one. "I hope my story brings a little light to your path," she wrote on one copy, handing it to a young woman who said the book had inspired her to reconnect with her own grandmother. These small interactions reinforced for Margaret that her journey, although full of difficulties, had had a positive impact on other lives. Among those present was the journalist Michael Tanner, who had written the initial article about Margaret. He came over to congratulate her and commented, "You're not just a local inspiration, Margaret. Your story has the power to reach the world. Margaret laughed, embarrassed, and replied, I just am who I am, Michael. If this helps someone, I'm more than satisfied. The sincerity in her words touched the journalist even more, who promised to continue sharing her story on new platforms. The event ended with a surprise that left Margaret speechless. The pastor of the local church, Reverend Henry, took the stage to present a plaque of recognition on behalf of the community. It read, To Margaret Adams, for her life of love and generosity, which inspires us all. Margaret received the plaque with tears in her eyes, moved by the unexpected honor. I never did anything expecting recognition, she said, holding up the sign. But I thank you from the bottom of my heart. You are all part of my life. That night, upon returning home, Margaret looked at the sign and the bouquet of flowers she was holding. He sat down in his favorite armchair and smiled. Despite everything he had experienced, he had never imagined that his story would be valued in this way. Sophia sat next to her, holding her grandmother's hand. Grandma, today the world saw what I always knew. You are extraordinary. Margaret shook her granddaughter's hand and replied, If I am, it's because you always believed in me. The months following the book's release brought even more surprises for Margaret and Sophia. The book became a regional success, being featured in local bookstores and gaining space in community libraries. People from other cities began sending letters to Margaret, sharing how her story had inspired them. Some reported how they had changed their priorities in life, dedicating more time to the people they loved. Your story made me realize I was valuing the wrong things, wrote one Houston woman. Now I visit my mom every week and tell her how grateful I am for everything she did for me. Sophia, seeing the growing reach of Margaret's story, began planning new ways to share her grandmother's message. Grandma, did you know that the book has already reached other parts of the country? She said one day, while showing comments on her cell phone from readers in states like California and New York. Margaret, still in disbelief, laughed and replied, I can barely imagine it. Who knew such a simple story could travel so far? But for Sophia, the impact was obvious. Margaret's message of humility and resilience was universal and timeless. One quiet morning, Sophia received an unexpected call. It was from a national organization that promoted events about inspiring life stories. They wanted to invite Margaret to be one of the speakers at their annual conference in Austin, Texas. Sophia was excited, but knew that convincing Margaret would be a challenge. When she told her grandmother the news, Margaret shook her head and said, Sophia, I'm not a speaker. I'm just a woman who lived her life the way she knew how. But with patience and love, Sophia explained that sharing her story with even more people could make a bigger difference. Margaret, although hesitant, ended up accepting the invitation, as long as she could be herself, without trying to impress anyone. On the day of the event, the auditorium was packed, with hundreds of people waiting to hear Margaret's story. When it was her turn to speak, she walked onto the stage slowly, holding the microphone tightly. I'm not a speaker, she began, but I am someone who believes in the power of little things. Today, I want to remind everyone that sometimes the simplest gestures are the ones that change lives. His words, spoken with sincerity and emotion, deeply touched the audience. Margaret talked about her childhood, her challenges, and the love that guided every decision in her life. At the end, he said something that stuck in everyone's memory. If my story teaches anything, I hope it is this. Never underestimate the impact of your kindness. Even when no one is looking, she makes a difference. The standing ovation that followed was so long that Margaret was visibly moved but deeply grateful. After the event, Margaret and Sophia were approached by people who wanted to share their own stories and thanks. An older man named Joseph approached with teary eyes. Listening to you today made me realize that I need to reconcile with my sister. I haven't spoken to her in 15 years, but you gave me the courage to change that. Margaret held his hand and replied, It's never too late to fix what really matters. Back in Evergreen Hills, Margaret decided she wanted to return all the affection she was receiving. With Sophia's help, he began organizing monthly meetings at the local church, where anyone could share their life stories. Everyone has something valuable to tell, she said, These gatherings became popular, attracting people of all ages. For Margaret, it was a way to continue the legacy her story had started, inspiring genuine connections and reclaiming the value of human experiences. Despite all the changes in her life, Margaret never stopped being who she was. She continued to tend to her yard, cook for Sophia, and welcome anyone who came to her door. "The world may be paying attention to me now, but that doesn't change what matters," she once said. For Margaret, her essence remained in simplicity, loving, serving, and being grateful for each day. Sophia, in turn, felt fulfilled seeing her grandmother shining in a way she had always believed possible. "Grandma, you taught the world to look beyond appearances and value what really matters," she said. Margaret, with her serene smile, replied, "I just lived my life the way I knew how. The rest was transformed by you, my dear." For both of them, this was proof that, with love and dedication, even the simplest stories can inspire extraordinary changes. The months following the event in Austin brought even more changes for Margaret and Sophia. Margaret's story, which initially touched only the local community, now reached people from all parts of the country. The book Roots of Love, it became a symbol of inspiration, appearing in book clubs, schools, and even corporate events, where it was used as an example of resilience and leading by example. Margaret, however, was still surprised by the repercussions. "It's strange to think that my life, so simple, has anything to teach," she told Sophia over a leisurely breakfast. But Sophia knew it wasn't just Margaret's story that touched people. It was her heart. One of the most exciting initiatives to emerge from the backlash was the creation of a community program in Evergreen Hills called Stories That Inspire. Led by Sophia, the project brought together young and old people to share their life experiences, promoting mutual learning. Margaret was the special guest at the first meeting, and although she was nervous, she once again charmed everyone with her authenticity. "Each of us carries a story that can change someone's world," she said, looking at the young people. "Never underestimate the power of your words." The event was a success, and the program began to attract participants from several nearby cities. Meanwhile, Margaret received a special invitation. A documentary about her life would be produced by an independent team. The project, funded by donations, aimed to capture the essence of Margaret and the impact she had on so many people. Initially hesitant, Margaret accepted on one condition: that the documentary would not be about glorifying her, but about inspiring others to value their own stories and connections. During filming, the team accompanied her in her simple routine, highlighting moments such as preparing a cake for Sophia, caring for the flowers in the yard, and visiting friends and neighbors. The documentary, titled Margaret, Beauty and Simplicity, was launched at a community event in the same library where the book had been presented. People of all ages filled the space to watch the premiere. The film brought tears to the eyes of many, especially when Margaret spoke about the sacrifices she had made to raise Sophia and the lessons she had learned throughout her life. After the screening, Margaret was received with a warm ovation. "I never imagined something like this could happen to me," she said, emotionally. "Thank you everyone for listening to me and believing that my story is worth telling." As the impact of Margaret's story grew, she received a surprising amount of letters and emails from people thanking her for her inspiration. Some shared personal experiences of overcoming, while others expressed how the story had motivated them to reconnect with family members or to value their own roots. Margaret made a point of answering them all with Sophia's help. "Every person who writes deserves to be heard," she said. For Margaret, each letter was a reminder that, without even knowing it, she had made a significant difference in someone's life. However, Margaret was also keen to keep her feet on the ground. Despite the opportunities that arose, such as more invitations to lectures and events, she always prioritized her routine and her moments with Sophia. "I don't want to lose what really matters," she explained, as she tended to her flowers. For Margaret, connecting with her granddaughter and the community remained her greatest joy. Sophia admired this attitude, as she knew that, even in the face of so much recognition, Margaret would never stop being the humble and loving woman she always was. One of the most memorable moments occurred when a high school in Houston invited Margaret to be the keynote speaker at their graduation. It was at a graduation that this all started. Margaret told Sophia, smiling. At the event, she shared her reflections with young people, emphasizing the importance of respecting each person's stories. Remember, not everyone you meet shows their struggles, she said, but everyone carries something that deserves to be valued. After the speech, the graduates gave a standing ovation, many going up to her to thank her in person. That same month, Sophia was surprised by news that moved both her and Margaret. The state governor decided to recognize Margaret with an award of contribution to the community, highlighting the impact of her story in promoting empathy and unity. The ceremony would be held in Austin, and although Margaret was reluctant to accept the recognition, Sophia convinced her that it was a celebration of everything they had accomplished together. "Grandma, this is more than a prize. It's a way of telling the world that simple people like you can change lives." The ceremony in Austin was a milestone in Margaret and Sophia's lives. Held in the state capitol's imposing auditorium, the event was attended by community leaders, educators, and Margaret's family. As she walked up to the stage to receive her award, Margaret felt the weight and honor of that moment. "I'm not a woman of big speeches," she began, her voice calm but firm. "But today I want to say something that I believe deeply. Each of you has the power to transform the world around you. Sometimes all it takes is kindness and the courage to act." After the event, Margaret and Sophia returned to Evergreen Hills with hearts full of gratitude. Despite all the attention, Margaret insisted on resuming her peaceful routine. "That's enough," she told Sophia. "What matters now is to continue living simply." But even as she tried to return to anonymity, Margaret's impact continued to grow. Community groups began to form in his honor, inspired by his values and history. "What started as your journey is now a mission for all of us," said a neighbor during a local meeting. In the years that followed, Margaret continued to be a beloved and respected figure, not only in Evergreen Hills, but in many other communities. Although she avoided the spotlight, she continued to attend community gatherings and share her wisdom on special occasions. For her, the most important thing was that her story encouraged people to value human connections and the power of love. "If I can inspire someone to be kinder or to value those around them, then my life will have been worth it," she told Sophia in conversation. Sophia, in turn, became a confident and purposeful young woman. Inspired by her grandmother, she decided to pursue a career in social work, dedicating herself to helping families in vulnerable situations. Whenever she faced challenges, she remembered Margaret's words and examples, which taught her to never give up, even in the most difficult situations. "My grandmother gave me more than love," Sophia said in an interview years later. "She gave me a purpose and the certainty that we can make a difference in the world." Over time, Margaret's book continued to inspire readers around the world. It was translated into other languages and included in school curricula as an example of a story of life and overcoming. Sophia, who now managed the rights to the book, made sure that part of the profits went to community projects and education programs. To her, this was Margaret's true legacy, an impact that spread far beyond her small town. When Margaret turned 80, the community organized a surprise celebration in her honor. Hundreds of people attended, including former neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had been touched by her story. Margaret, visibly moved, thanked everyone with her characteristic humility. "I'm just a woman who lived as she knew how," she said. "But each of you has made my life richer than I ever imagined." In the last phase of her life, Margaret dedicated herself to spending more time with Sophia and the friends she had made along the way. She also continued to tend to her garden, which was now visited by people who wanted to see the space where the Margaret of Evergreen Hills found peace. For Margaret, the garden was a reflection of her life. Simple, yet full of life and meaning. When Margaret finally left years later, her story lived on, not just through the book and the documentary, but most importantly in the hearts of the people she touched. Sophia, now a mature woman, kept her grandmother's legacy alive, teaching new generations what she learned from her. For Sophia, Margaret was not just a grandmother. She was proof that simple lives can be extraordinary when lived with love, courage, and purpose.